I'm Jim Boyer, and I'm going to briefly summarize an agrivoltaics report, which was recently published by Dovetail Partners. What Dovetail Partners is, or what agrivoltaics is all about, is simply the merging of solar energy and agriculture production. And so we're going to talk about that and go over a few things, including the concept of land use efficiency. We'll talk about benefits of agrivoltaics, solar energy, economics, and a few other things in exploring this topic. This whole idea was introduced in 1980 at the German-based Fraunhofer Institute. And Germany has long been a leader in solar energy production. They have a population density at that time of 8.8 times that of the US. It's about 6.5 times that now. And they recognize the need to develop energy source through solar, through renewable energy. Germany has a high population, also not much in the way of energy resources itself. So they recognize the need for solar energy, and also, because of the dense population, efficiency of land use. And their report really emphasized the idea of more efficiently using land. So the idea of land use efficiency is expressed in terms of a land equivalent ratio. This is how they describe things. And the basic formula here is that you look at the yield of crops relative, if you're combining crop production and solar energy production, you look at what the yield would be if you did both of those things on the land at the same time, as opposed to what the yield would be if you did one thing alone. So if you raise crops alone, you'd compare that to crops plus solar. And then you do the same thing with energy. You look at the energy yield if you're combining with agricultural production, as opposed to what would happen in the way of yield if you just produce solar energy only. And then 8.3% is subtracted from here to account for land surface area that's occupied by the support structure for solar panels. So that's the idea. And so described here graphically is the concept. If you had 2 hectares of land, there's 2.47 acres per hectare. But if you had 2 hectares and 1 hectare was devoted to 100% growing wheat and the other to 100% solar electricity, you'd have that yield. You'd have 1 hectare equivalent of electricity generation and 1 hectare equivalent of wheat. On the other hand, if you combine these things on both hectares, then you would get a reduced wheat yield on both areas of land. You'd also get less solar production on both areas of land than if they were dedicated solely to one or the other. And so you'd get, in this example, 160% wheat and 160% solar electricity, which by the calculation I just showed you would be a 60% increase in land use efficiency. Talk for a minute about land requirements for solar development. The Department of Energy estimates that solar could provide 40% of U.S. electricity by 2040. And so that by 2040, if we did all of this by solar panels, we'd need as much as 5.7 million acres of land. And by 2050, if we keep going ahead with our goal, another 4.6 million acres, which adds up to 10.3 million acres. Then if we were to electrify the entire economy, transportation and everything else, we'd need about double that land area, or as much as 21 million acres. So that's a lot of acres on the one hand, but on the other hand, it really isn't, because you look at 21 million acres in the context of how much land we have dedicated to agriculture in the US, and it turns out it's a little less than 2% of the total area that we use for ag purposes in the US. So it's a lot, and yet it's relatively little. There can be a problem around some urban areas where there's a concentration of a need for solar. And then in those cases, there could be a conflict with agriculture. All right, so we look at this concept of combining agriculture and solar energy production, agrivoltaics, and look at specific applications within agriculture. Yeah, research to date shows potential applications of agrivoltaics in production of food and especially of vegetables. There's some applications that don't work so well, but vegetables is one type of crop that looks like there are potential applications and even direct benefits. Production of forage crops related to that, animal agriculture, potential applications to aquaculture, and also an indirect benefit to agriculture in promotion of pollinator habitat. All right, let's look at food crop production a little bit. Turns out that if you put and I'm going to talk about a standard solar panel here for a little bit, and then I'll later on talk about something other than a standard solar panel. But if standard solar panels are used, shading can be a significant issue. You can see in the photograph to the upper right that under that solar panel that's shown there, there's shade that is cast. And turns out that even a little bit of shade can reduce yields of quite a number of food crop species. And some of them, it can be quite a substantial reduction. Research has shown that yield can be knocked down as little as 3%, but as much as 62% for 80% of tested crops. So shading is kind of a big deal. And if agrivoltaics is going to be applied to agriculture, it's an issue that looms large and that anybody that attempts to get in the business will have to pay attention to. One of the crops that is very much affected by shading is corn. And in that crop, say you get 50% shading from solar panels, you can see the picture at the right. That's not a complete land coverage of solar panel by any means. But if you had coverage of 50% on the land, it has been found to result in a number of research tests, reduction of virtually every measure of corn growth and grain yield. So corn and agrivoltaics is not a likely marriage that's likely to happen. On the other hand, there have been experiments with other crops, such as wheat, cereal grains, and other types of crops that show that, yes, there is a reduction in yield when agriculture is combined with solar panels, but not nearly as dramatic as is seen in corn. And so land use efficiency has been demonstrated in virtually every research test that has been conducted. Again, as stated when we're talking about land use efficiency, it's basically a given. If you combine agrivoltaics with the land, there will be lower outputs of both energy and agricultural goods. But one goal can be that land use efficiency is increased. There are exceptions to the business of reduced plant yield, a few exceptions that are notable. Some crops actually benefit from shading, and you get even greater yields than with traditional panels. Again, I'm talking traditional panels here, when they make up the solar array. And the greatest benefits are on hotter, drier climates. Think Arizona, for example. Crops like alfalfa, several varieties of lettuce, other vegetables and fruits, and strawberries in particular, you actually get an increased yield. So there's no downside to using agrivoltaics with these crops. It's a win-win. You get solar production, and you don't get any reduction in crop yields. So the land use efficiency that can be created with these types of crops is very high. A study in Arizona, tomato yields almost 3 times greater with AV compared to typical practice. Yields of peppers double what they might have been otherwise. So again, very great increases in land use efficiency, and really no downside to a farmer or land manager from combining solar production with agriculture production. Here's an example of agrivoltaics and fruit production in Australia. These look like oranges, but I'm not sure. Now, I've been talking about traditional solar panels, But there are under development, and actually some on the market today, solar panels that are light filtering. And by that I mean these panels have the capacity to let a portion of the light spectrum through the panel while using a specific part of the spectrum to generate solar energy. It turns out that plants typically use only about half of the solar radiation they're exposed to. And the whole business of photosynthesis, which of course drives plant growth and crop yield production, is driven by the longer intensive energy wavelengths, basically the red part of the spectrum. So somewhere in the 400 to 700 nanometer range is what plants really need. They really don't need the rest. And the great part of this is that it's the other part of the range that is most valuable for generating solar energy. So if panels can be designed so that only the 400 to 700 nanometer part of the spectrum penetrates the panels, the rest is kept on the panel surface for generating energy. The potential here is that plant growth could be substantially enhanced with little or no effect on energy conversion capacity of solar panels. At that point, then there's almost no question that the agrivoltaics approach there's no downside really to any to either side, either the energy producer or the agriculture producer. Some of these panels are available today. You can, for example, you can buy glass that is designed so that the part of the wavelength that would cause fading in furniture and in front of a window and so forth, you can buy a window that will keep that part of the wavelength from penetrating into your house. Other kind of panels are available at least for research into agrivoltaics, and the problem right now is they are not sophisticated enough to specifically separate precisely according to the spectrum that you need to pass through and to remain on the surface, which is kind of a big deal because if you get it even a little bit wrong, it has a big effect on what happens. And also, they're not available at the right price point right now. They're too expensive at the moment. Talk a little bit about animal agriculture. Now, it turns out, in Germany, the focus was on land use efficiency because they have such a high population density compared to, for example, the United States. But research is showing that there are other benefits of agrivoltaics beyond land use efficiency, even though every test is tending to show that there is an increase in land use efficiency with agrivoltaics. So we'll get into a little bit of that. One thing that's been an issue for a long time, and it's kind of a growing issue, is heat stress in animals that are out to pasture. And that concern is rising worldwide. The number of extreme heat days, high humidity, extreme heat is rising, and it's causing increased stress in animals of all kinds. And early findings in research point to increased animal health with availability of shade. If the animals start to get stressed, they will naturally seek out shade, and this is helpful to animal health. Sheep are particularly well suited to AV, and in fact, if you look at agrivoltaics installations across the U.S. today that are other than demonstration plots, they're heavily tilted toward animal agriculture as one of the places where the concentration occurs. The support structures for raising sheep are similar to what a solar system would be just in general. And furthermore, sheep eliminate the need for mowing. If you got a traditional solar array, one thing you don't want to have happen is have vegetation grow up to the height that it's shading the solar panels and cutting down on energy production. And so you have to find a way to knock that vegetation down periodically. Well, sheep take care of that problem. They're little automatic mowing machines in effect. One calculation showed that if all of the domestic sheep, and at that time number was 5.2 million of them, were shifted to AV, we could quadruple what was then the utility scale solar capacity in the US. So there's a lot of potential here, and there's actually evidence that utility scale solar is moving in this direction. There are more and more of them that are incorporating sheep into their systems. On the left is an experimental system in Morris, Minnesota, that was run over a fairly short period of time, only a couple of months. The authors said if they had run it longer, they think they would have found evidence of reduced meat production, or milk production. But the early findings were that there was no loss of milk production, but less heat stress, which the research team indicated would be likely to lead to reduced milk production over a period of time. On the right, Eastern Oregon, Agrivoltaics and beef cattle, they found improved forage under the panels, better soil health, significantly lower water consumption in the form of the water needs of the cattle themselves. Another potential application for aquaculture is in aquaculture, and the word now has been coined agrivoltaics to describe combining of solar energy and aquaculture. It says here that AV is energy intensive. What it should say is that aquaculture is energy intensive, and power is required to drive oxygenation equipment and distribution of fish food, artificial lighting, and so on. And so installation of solar panels above fish tanks or ponds provides shade. It cools the water. It can reduce surface evaporation, especially if these tanks happen to be outside, or fish are being raised in an outdoor pond. And then at the same time, you're generating power needed for system operations. There is not too much of this actually in play in the US. Asia has embraced this concept to a greater extent than in the US. But it looks like there's a lot of potential here. And so here's simply a graphic indicating aquaculture to raise shrimp, and then combining that with solar energy production. Another application of agrivoltaics is in pollinator promotion. And I mentioned sheep earlier as being, to the extent that there's commercial use of agrivoltaics in the US today, they're being applied to sheep production. And another big use is in development of pollinator habitat. A great number of principal food crops globally, at least 87, are dependent upon pollinators for seed production. And as has been reported widely, there's been a significant decline in pollinator numbers in recent decades. And a big reason for that appears to be habitat loss that is amenable to development of pollinators. And pollinators include bees, wasps, butterflies, birds, all those kinds of things. Research has shown that the greatest benefit to crops comes when the pollinator habitat is located about a half mile from the crop. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a study recently. They used an effective distance of 1.5 kilometers, 0.6 of a mile, from existing and planned utility scale solar facilities, and identified about 1,350 square miles that could benefit from pollinator-friendly AV. This is not a whole lot of square miles in the big scheme of things, but nonetheless, along corridors for power transmission and so on, development of pollinator habitat in conjunction with agrivoltaics looks like it has quite a bit of potential. Just talk briefly about overall potential benefits of AV. We've talked a lot about, or a little bit about, efficiency of land use, but other advantages include things like lower soil temperatures underneath the solar panel. And if you look at the picture in the upper right, you look at that solar panel distribution, you can say to yourself, well, there's not a lot of, there's shade under those panels, but there's not shade in other places. If those panels were raised a little higher, what you'd find is as the sun moves across the sky, what also moves is the shading that is created by those panels. And so you get a moving pattern of shade that goes across the land that results in generally lower soil temperatures in the area of the solar arrays. That in turn results in reduction of soil water loss and water demand and withdrawals from the water table and all that kind of thing. Very important as we continue to warm the climate, and especially in hot regions like the southwestern United States. We've talked just briefly about reduction of heat stress in livestock. And then a big factor potentially is for farmland managers, for farmers, the potential for diversification and possibly greater farm income. When farm prices are down and perhaps energy prices are not, there's the potential of diversification of income and reduction of risk in farming. My wife comes from a farming background, and she's well aware of the risks that comes with farming, what she saw in her family. With respect to soil, shading provided by solar panels has been found to reduce soil temperatures, and a reduction in soil temperatures results in a reduced rate of water evaporation from the soil. And another benefit is that plant transpiration is also reduced, and the combined effect of reduced soil temperature and reduced evaporation from the soil and a reduction in transpiration conserves both plant energy and water. Modeling's been done of systems in the southwestern U.S., the dry, arid southwestern U.S., and found that the extent of water evaporation is closely correlated with solar array coverage and the shading that goes along with it. And water loss reductions of up to 30% have been documented under solar arrays. Another study looking at land use scenarios in several locations across the U.S., not just a concentrated location, found benefits of considerable benefits, water retention of over 95% in one case, and 19% on AV sites compared to pre-solar agricultural land use. Very significant impacts. A note of caution here is that a Colorado study looked at this whole issue of shading and water retention, the whole business of water loss and so on. And they did point out that with standard and not opaque solar panels, there appear to be clear limits to shading benefits. And what they found was that there's nearly a 1-to-1 ratio of water savings to yield loss in some cases. So there's a pretty definite trade-off here, remembering that shading from solar panels also has a negative effect in most cases on plant yield. And then there's a 1-to-1 ratio of water savings to yield loss, water yield loss in some cases. There's clearly a need to work to optimize the degree of shading. The answer isn't simply to just produce as much shading as possible. Just a couple of notes on design alternatives. There are a number of potential ways to array solar panels. And you can see in this picture that, you could put solar panels on top of greenhouses, something that can be done now with little or no downside, I think. Panels can be installed vertically, and that allows, it's probably the best configuration for using large equipment for harvesting everything else. A trade-off there is that when you put panels vertically and don't angle them to the sun, the the solar production is only about half of what it would be otherwise. But it's got a potential use in some applications. For large livestock grazing, the panels provide shade that can provide protection under severe weather, things like that. But the panels have to be raised higher, so the cost of putting those up there is greater than if you didn't raise them that high. The structure will cost more. If on the other hand, sheep are going to be raised, the panels can be put closer to the ground, as is shown down in the lower left. And and remember, the sheep also provide a little automatic mowing function. And then if you're producing specialty crops, well, there might be a different array, a different degree of coverage, a different amount of shade that is brought across the land. So a number of different possibilities, and certainly all of them are not shown here, for use of AB in conjunction with agriculture. And then a number of configurations, not just the vertically aligned panels. So you look on the lower left, you can see vertically arranged panels and large harvesting equipment operating in the rows. Well, that's one configuration. Another possibility is to raise the structure that supports solar panels high enough so very large equipment can go beneath it, as shown on the upper left. Another configuration in the upper right. And then you can see a smaller tractor operating under solar panels in the lower right. Just a word about solar energy production AV. Are there any advantages to solar energy production through combination with agrivoltaics? And it turns out there are a few. Remember that in basically every configuration, you're going to get less solar production, at least with standard solar panels, than if you just cover the land with solar panels. So there's a trade-off there. However, large configurations of solar panels, very large solar farms, have a heat island effect of their own. And if solar panels are combined with AV, there's a moderation of heat island effects. The likelihood of erosion from storm-off runover has been found to be reduced in experimental placements of solar panels across the land. And thirdly, probably most important, is that the optimum temperature for a solar panel at the surface is actually, I think it's in the low 70s, about 73, 74 degrees. If the temperature rises above that, there is a trade-off, a reduction of about 1/10 to 1% of efficiency for every couple degrees centigrade that the temperature rises. And so you really don't want those panels to become too hot. And if solar panels are simply spread across the land over a landscape that doesn't really have much or little vegetation underneath, those panels are likely to get too hot, and it reduces the efficiency of the solar panels themselves. So by putting vegetation beneath those panels and getting the cooling effects, the reduction in soil temperature and all the rest, you can help to bring down the surface temperature of the panels and increase efficiency of electrical production. Here's an example of a solar system that's likely to lead to adverse heating. You can see a dense concentration of solar panels with very little in the way of vegetation beneath it. And that configuration probably has less efficiency of solar energy production than if that were configured differently. Emerging technology with regard to opaque solar panels. Remember, this is, if you can make it as opaque solar panel configuration, then the whole issue of reduced agriculture production beneath those panels goes away. And so when those are available to come on the market, assuming that's going to happen, then the whole game pretty much changes for the better, and economic returns are likely to be better, and this is almost a no-lose situation at that point. One thing that should be mentioned is that production of solar energy on a commercial scale requires proximity to a power transmission corridor or a substation. And so we looked at that need for 10.3 million acres of land if we were to hit our 2050 solar energy targets as a nation, or 21 million acres if we want to electrify the whole economy. Pointed out, that 21 million acres is what would be needed, but it's not like agrivoltaics is likely to be spread across the landscape evenly to take in that 21 million acres. Effectively, what it means is those areas, at least for commercial scale, have to be near transmission lines. So what we're going to see is a concentration of agrivoltaics around transmission corridors, power transmission corridors. And so anyway, that's a consideration. So a farmer that is not near a transmission corridor, for example, a tenth of a megawatt installation of solar panels, that requires about a half an acre of solar panels. Well, and a tenth of a megawatt is enough electricity to provide electricity to, on average, 17 American homes. So if you have a small community, or if you have a very large farm or whatever, it might very well be possible to put in solar array that would provide, would take you off the grid and your neighbors as well, and perhaps you could sell some to the local community. Let's talk just a minute about economics. That's a question that a lot of people ask. Unfortunately, it's not been very much studied, or at least not very much studied and published. What has been published is that the investment requirements are generally higher than for construction of a typical solar farm. If you're combining animal agriculture and AV, for example, the wiring has to be protected, perhaps raised so that animals don't rub against it and do the things they do. Another thing that's been determined is that the life of a solar panel, useful life, is about 25 to 30 years, and a support structure somewhere around 50, 60 years. One study in Germany that did talk a little bit about capital cost indicated that there's about a 30% greater cost than for conventional solar, and similar operational costs. So that's a non-trivial difference. And so the question is would increase in land use efficiency that comes by combining agriculture and power production be enough to offset that 30% greater operational cost and investment cost difference? That really has yet to be determined before AV can take off in any significant way in the United States. As indicated earlier, virtually every study has shown increased land use efficiency. There has been increased land use efficiency. And again, is that enough to compensate for higher costs? What is being seen is an increase in AV across the globe, not reported as whether these are being subsidized. But if they're going to succeed in this country, it's pretty clear that they will have to do that on their own. Just a note about the current state of AV development. Within the US, at least, this is really could only be considered in an early development stage. And systems across the country range from 660 megawatts. That's a pretty big installation. So as little of a tenth of a megawatt. I indicated a tenth of a megawatt would power about 17 homes on average. But about 70% of the current projects are demonstration projects with capacity of 5 megawatts or less. So while there are some pretty big installations in the US that are commercial, this really has yet to take off significantly. As indicated earlier, the majority of systems that are in place are used primarily for raising livestock, and as a subset of that, primarily sheep. Pollinator habitat is another big one, and there's also some commercial installations that focus on native grasses, really encouragement of expansion of native prairie and native grasses. So just to summarize, this AV is a relatively new concept that's a subject of growing interest globally. The use of non-opaque solar panels, in other words, standard panels, can significantly reduce yields compared to conventional agriculture, meaning that they have to pay a lot of attention to solar panel coverage and configuration on the land, depending upon the crop that is being raised. Exceptions to crop yields and shading are vegetables, and some specific vegetables, and most dramatically in arid regions of the country. And again, we've talked about the focus on sheep and native prairies and pollinator habitat. As solar radiation filtering photovoltaic panels come into the picture, this will be a game changer. So it's really something to watch. How soon or whether those will come into being remains to be seen, but it's an exciting development to pay attention to. Benefits to land use efficiency, animal health and production, the soil, water use reduction and loss, a big one, particularly as the planet warms, and in boosting solar panel performance, advantages there as well. So we'll pay attention. AV may be coming soon to a farm near you. We'll just have to wait and see. Stay tuned. The entire report can be viewed at the Dovetail website. We've only hit the high points here, and you can get a more complete reading there.